Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into literally one of the most dramatic, earth-shattering chain reactions in modern history. We're talking about a series of events that didn't just, topple an empire. They completely rewire the global political and economic landscape. From the absolute grim floors of 19th century factories to the freezing, chaotic streets of Petrograd, we're going to trace the exact spark that ignited the Russian Revolution and explore the massive global fallout that followed. Let's get right into it.
Okay, here is our roadmap for today. We'll start with the rise of socialism, move to Russia before the revolution, cover the 1905 awakening and the World War I crisis, before hitting the climax in the 1917 revolutions, and finally concluding with the emergence of the Soviet Union.
Part 1. The Rise of Socialism. To really wrap our heads around the Russian Revolution, we actually have to rewind a bit and look at Europe during the Industrial Revolution, right? Because unchecked capitalism was radically changing society. You had factory owners racking up massive, unprecedented wealth, while the actual workers faced brutal realities, grindingly long hours, incredibly dangerous conditions, and terribly low wages. That deep systemic alienation laid the foundation for something entirely new: socialism. Early socialists fundamentally pushed back against this unchecked system. For them, it wasn't just about the money. It was about the profound exploitation of the worker. The core belief here was that a nation's wealth and its industries shouldn't just enrich a handful of folks at the top, but should benefit society as a whole. They wanted to put a hard stop to worker exploitation and make economic equality the primary focus.
And this brilliantly illustrates how key thinkers like Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels saw the world. They viewed society as being fractured into two major, totally unbridgeable camps. On one side, you've got the bourgeoisie, the owners, the ones hoarding the capital in the factories, and on the other, the proletariat, the massive base of workers putting in the actual sweat and physical labor. Marx and Engels argued this wasn't just unfair, it was mathematically and socially unstable. It's like a giant ticking time bomb just waiting to snap. In their view, the working class was ultimately destined to rise up and completely overthrow the capitalist owners.
Part 2. Russia before the revolution.
So, that's the ideological powder keg brewing over in Europe. Now let's look at the specific environment where those ideas actually caught fire: pre-1917 Russia. At this time, Russia wasn't some modern democracy. It was an absolute autocracy ruled with an iron fist by Tsar Nicholas II. We're talking about a sprawling empire stretching across 11 time zones. And Russian society back then was basically this massive feudal hangover trying to rapidly industrialize. It was sharply divided into three distinct groups. At the very top, a tiny, incredibly wealthy nobility hoarding the land and influence. Below them, a rapidly growing class of industrial workers crammed into densely packed cities. And out in the vast countryside, a massive, overwhelming population of peasant farmers.
Now, what's really interesting about this setup is the sheer, concentrated weight of suffering the vast majority of the population was carrying. For both the workers and the peasants, everyday life was defined by extreme, inescapable poverty. Land distribution was wildly unequal, meaning peasant families were constantly struggling just to grow enough food to survive those brutal Russian winters. Over in the urban centers, workers faced horrific factory conditions. Workplace mortality rates were skyrocketing, and the wages were barely livable. And compounding all of this economic misery, a total lack of political rights. They had zero legal voice, no vote, and absolutely no peaceful way to demand change.
Part 3. The 1905 Awakening.
You can only compress a society for so long before it violently pushes back, right? The immense pressure within Russian society finally began to crack the surface, and all that frustration started manifesting as physical resistance in the streets. But generalized, simmering anger doesn't usually start a revolution on its own. There's almost always a catalyst, a specific dramatic spark that sets the whole forest on fire. So think about this. What was the specific event that finally tipped the scales and triggered nationwide protests across the entire Russian Empire?
The answer is a truly horrific tragedy that became known as Bloody Sunday. In January of 1905, a priest named Georgy Gaban led a massive group of peaceful protesters right up to the Tsar's Winter Palace. And this is absolutely crucial. They were not armed revolutionaries. They were carrying religious icons, they were singing hymns, and they genuinely believed the Tsar was this benevolent little father who just didn't know how badly his people were suffering. They literally just wanted to hand him a petition for better working conditions. But instead of being heard, they were met by armed soldiers who fired directly into the peaceful crowd. Hundreds were killed or wounded. That brutal, incredibly disproportionate response instantly shattered the myth of the benevolent Tsar. It was the absolute match that sparked nationwide, uncontrollable outrage.
Part 4. World War I Crisis.
So the 1905 revolution forced a few minor concessions from the Tsar, like the creation of a limited parliament called the Duma, but the core problems were entirely unresolved. Then came the ultimate accelerant to this already volatile situation, Russia's disastrous entry into World War I. If 1905 cracked the foundation, the First World War completely obliterated it. The devastation this war brought to Russia really cannot be overstated. First, the military suffered catastrophic defeats with massive casualties. The logistical failures were just staggering. Soldiers were literally sent to the front lines without rifles, told to just pick up weapons from their fallen comrades. Second, this desperate war effort completely drained resources from the countryside. This led to a massive breakdown of the railway system and severe food shortages back home. People in the cities were literally starving in breadlines. And third, the sheer unimaginable cost of the conflict led to total economic collapse. With a humiliated army and a starving populace, public anger was just growing exponentially. The entire imperial system was falling apart at the seams.
Part 5. The 1917 Revolutions.
And that brings us to the absolute climax of our explainer. The year the empire finally totally exploded, 1917. Because of the sheer scale of the institutional collapse, this revolution didn't just happen all at once. It actually occurred in two massive, distinct waves. We know the deep context stretches back to Bloody Sunday in 1905, but fast forward to February 1917. This first wave was entirely spontaneous and grassroots. It was sparked by desperate, starving women protesting in Petrograd during International Women's Day demanding bread. The protests swelled massively. But this time, the military outright refused to fire on the crowds. Instead, they joined them. Tsar Nicholas II lost all leverage and was forced to abdicate, officially ending 3 centuries of Romanov rule. A provisional government stepped in, but they made a fatal error. They refused to pull Russia out of the wildly unpopular World War I, so the suffering continued. And this perfectly set the stage for the second wave in October 1917. Now, this wasn't a grassroots riot. It was a highly organized, strategic coup. A radical socialist faction called the Bolsheviks, led by the brilliant and ruthless Vladimir Lenin, completely capitalized on the chaos. They boldly seized key infrastructure in Petrograd and overthrew that provisional government entirely.
Part 6. The Soviet Union emerges.
With the Bolsheviks now firmly in control, the immediate aftermath was unlike anything the world had ever seen. They didn't just want a new government, they wanted a fundamentally restructured society based directly on those Marxist principles we talked about earlier. So the crucial point here is how rapid, radical, and genuinely shocking the new Bolshevik government's changes were to the global order. They delivered on Lenin's famous rallying cry of peace, land, and bread. Almost overnight, they completely nationalized the banking system, just yanking all financial power out of private hands. They systematically confiscated and redistributed millions of acres of land to the peasants, instantly wiping out the centuries-old wealth of the nobility. And they took strict, centralized control of all major industries. Actually, scratch the idea of gradual reform. This was the immediate, uncompromising seizure of private property, forcing socialist ideology directly into law.
These massive ideological and economic shifts culminated in the birth of a completely new global entity. The old Russian Empire with its czars and its nobles was gone forever. In its place, Russia officially became the Soviet Union, or the USSR. And let's be clear, this wasn't just a simple rebranding on a map. This was the establishment of the world's very first constitutionally socialist state. They were attempting to build an entirely alternative, parallel global system operating on a totally different set of economic and social rules than the established capitalist powers of the West. The entire geopolitical chessboard was instantly rewritten.
Now, why does this deeply matter to us today? Well, because the shockwaves of 1917 absolutely did not stop at the Russian border. The successful creation of the Soviet Union sent a powerful ideological tremor across the entire globe. It aggressively inspired socialist movements worldwide, giving them a tangible, real-world blueprint for success. Intriguingly, it also put massive pressure on capitalist countries in the West to rapidly improve workers' rights and enact social welfare programs. Honestly, a lot of that was out of sheer fear of facing their own working-class revolutions. Furthermore, it directly sparked the eventual creation of communist governments in other nations, from Eastern Europe to Asia. And it heavily fueled anti-colonial struggles, as occupied nations across the global South looked to the new Soviet model as a powerful strategy to overthrow imperial powers. This single revolution fundamentally redefined the 20th century. Which brings us to a final question I want to leave you with. How do the ideas and shockwaves of 1917 still shape our world today?
When you look at modern, ongoing debates about labor rights, economic equality, the limits of government control, and shifting global geopolitics, the echoes of the Russian Revolution are still ringing out loudly. I highly encourage you to keep exploring this topic because understanding 1917 is absolutely essential to understanding the complexities of the world we live in right now. Thanks for joining me for this explainer.